Hello, Melissa Kerman here with Melissa's Crafting Treehouse. Today I'm going to be sharing a technique I call impressions of tarnished foil, and today's project uses the Woodland embossing folder by Stampin' Up, and I am using some stamps today, but some of my projects, most of the ones I've done, don't actually use stamps, so this one happens to use the Thoughts and Prayers stamp set, also by Stampin' Up. We're going to use StazOn, Versamark, our heat tool, and a couple of embossing powders. So the first step is to take your StazOn ink pad, and mine is a pretty well used and somewhat old pad, so it's a little bit dried out, and I kind of like it that way because it helps me control how much ink I get. So the first step I'm going to do is a direct to paper technique, where I'm literally just streaking a little bit of the black StazOn onto my foil sheet. So it's kind of a subtle look. If your StazOn ink pad has more ink in it, it's going to be you're going to get more black and thicker streaks, and I generally recommend that you just test how it looks on your scratch paper first, so you kind of know what kind of effect you're going to get, and then you can decide whether you're going to press hard or have a more light touch. So next we're going to do a little stamping, and honestly on most of the other projects that I've done, the tarnished foil projects, I haven't done any stamping, but this is kind of, it's evolved a bit, and for this particular project I really wanted to add some images in the background to kind of complement the Woodland embossing folder. So I've inked up my stamp in Versamark, which is a clear sticky ink, especially good for heat embossing, but also good for putting a watermark on any color of ink pad. Versamark is an awesome ink pad for that reason, because it's super versatile. So you can probably see or not see that the Versamark, you guys can't see it, of course, and I can only see it if I put it in certain light, but I kind of generally know where I've put my images, and I'm just trying to get some of that lovely delicate foliage of that tree onto my silver foil. And I'm gonna kind of turn it a little bit so I can see where I might want to add some more. All right, this is going to be a background element, so it's not super important necessarily where it is or how much I do, but I just really like it in the background, and I think you'll see that in the final result. So now I'm just putting it into my gold embossing powder and tapping off the excess, and then I'm going to go ahead and heat this. So now you can see those lovely gold trees in the background. And the next thing I'm going to do is run this through my Big Shot, and because I just heated it, I also at the same time dried the StazOn that was in the background. If I had not used the heat tool, the StazOn might have been a little bit wet still, and if you put it into your embossing folder and push it through the Big Shot, it sort of presses the foil into your embossing folder, and some of that StazOn will get onto your embossing folder. So I either put a piece of paper on top if I'm doing it right away if it's still wet, or I dry it with the heat tool, just because I don't want to stain my embossing folders. All right, so now I'm gonna place this into my embossing folder, and I want my trees pushing out towards me, so the tree images are here on the back, so I have the Stampin' Up logo, the Sizzix logo, facing up at me, and then I'm going to place this in my embossing folder sort of strategically. I want to sort of show the embossed tree in the background as much as possible, sort of paying attention to where it is in these openings. And then I'm going to dry emboss it. There we go. So now it's got the impression in it. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my Versamark ink pad and just kind of lightly and delicately rub it over the surface. It's going to pick up, the Versamark's going to just go on the raised areas and kind of a little bit randomly here and there. I like to kind of go back in and maybe do a little bit on the edge, and you're sort of doing it a little bit blind, but then once you put the gold embossing powder on, you're going to see where it is, and then you can kind of decide if you want to adjust it from there. So you can kind of see on camera where I've gotten it. It's a bunch over here, down at the bottom. I want to sort of make sure my tree in the background shows up a bit, so I'm going to use my finger to rub it off there, and if I had felt like there was too much on here, I would rub more of it off. In the end, I want to make sure that I have a nice balance of the silver in the background, the gold, and then eventually we'll have copper and black as well in there. So I'm going to go ahead and heat it now. There it is with my gold on there, and I'm going to do the same process again. And when I use my Versamark this time, I'm going to kind of try to focus where I put it in places where the gold isn't. I'll try to overlap the gold a little bit, but then I want to kind of fill in some more of the silver areas, and maybe again I'll do an edge that doesn't have anything on it, maybe a corner. Just kind of play with putting it in various places. And now I'm going to grab my copper embossing powder. The copper is a little bit thicker, I find, so it gives you a bit of a heavier coating, so that's just something to be aware of. And you'll also, because you're using the ink pad that has a straight edge, you might end up with some straight lines, and if you like that, definitely leave it. Sometimes I'll sort of blur that line a little bit if I don't want it to be exactly a straight line. I want it to look sort of organic, not necessarily too linear, but I think I like how that looks. So the extent to which you can tell how much embossing powder is on there, you just leave it or rub it off. You can always add another layer of embossing powder later, so if you're worried about it being too much, just rub some off and then see what you think, and then you can add more later. So here it goes with my heat embossing of the copper. So just a word on the heat embossing, especially with this foil paper. You want to just heat it until it's melted and not any longer. The foil sheets have a little bit of a plasticized backing on them, so if you heat it too long in one sitting, if you will, it can curl up and melt a little bit. So I haven't had that problem too much with the silver foil, but I have played with this technique also with the copper foil paper and the gold, and the copper seems to be a little bit more sensitive to the heating, so just something to be aware of. So the next step I'm going to do is do the direct to paper technique with my StazOn, and once again, in this case, I'm going to rub it over the surface, and what it does is it really just picks up some of the shapes, the raised areas, and it also highlights some of the areas where the embossing powder is, and shows sort of the cool textures that the powder creates by sort of having it randomly placed all over the place. So I'm going to kind of put in as much or as little black as I want, and I always like to rub a little bit on the edge to kind of frame the whole piece. And you can use the corner of your StazOn pad. I've used mine quite a bit. You can see mine is kind of ragged, but it still works just fine. So I'm pretty happy with that. You could, like I said, you can go back in with more gold embossing powder or copper or any color of embossing powder you want. I just wanted to highlight that. This one spot here, you can really see the kind of texture of the embossing powder. So that's my technique. I did want to tell you too, when I first started doing this, I was taking pieces of cardstock and wrapping it with aluminum foil. And the first set of projects that I did that way, and they came out great. So just a little bit of evolution of this process. So this was done with a silver aluminum foil wrapped around cardstock. This is my very first project that I did. It only uses gold embossing powder. I didn't add the copper on this one. But this was a contest winning card in my demonstrator group, which inspired me to play with it more. And then this was another card I did. This is also done with aluminum foil wrapped around cardstock and also with the woodland embossing folder. And then on this one I did the technique on gold foil with the, I think it's called Pretty Petals embossing folder by Stampin' Up. And then last but not least, this project here I did more recently with the Hexagons embossing folder also by Stampin' Up. And I did the background here with the hexagons debossed or pushed in, and then this little element with the embossed with the hexagons pushing out. So I hope you like the technique today, and it inspires you to play and create, and have a great crafting day, and thanks for joining me.